Good morning. My name is Nida Galajis. Welcome to the Wilson Center. We're here today to discuss the end of multiculturalism in Europe, migrants, refugees, and their integration. We all know that modern liberal democracies rely on immigrants to sustain economic growth, especially in Europe, where the continent's population is shrinking or aging. Yet migrants are increasingly seen as importing risk into Europe. They're seen as competing for jobs with a growing number of unemployed, especially due to the European financial crisis. They're seen as a drain on state budgets, which are in many places operating under austerity. And they're seen as possible collaborators with global terrorist groups. Or as refugees, they're reminders of instability in the neighborhood. For a variety of reasons, it seems that these groups are becoming more vulnerable, especially as we see electoral results around Europe showing that there's a growing support and popularity of right-wing parties. So today we're going to discuss, we're going to try to unpack what this all means. Is multiculturalism dead? To what extent have European states been able to create multicultural societies? Have they been created and now are they being resisted, or have European states simply been unable to create a successful multicultural state? Our first panel will sort of bring together a lot of the polls and data that has been gathered, and we don't always have the opportunity to sort of compare all the data and try to get a clear picture of the landscape in Europe. So today we're very happy to have with us Hamutal Bernstein, the Program Officer for Immigration and Integration at the German Marshall Fund, Mary Giovanoli, the Director of Immigration Policy Center, and Jamie Bartlett, who's Head of Violence and Extremism Program at Demos UK. So without further delay, we'll begin. I think all of our speakers will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then save your questions for the end, because then we'll have a discussion before coffee. So we'll start with Hamutal. You have the floor.
Did you say discussion before coffee?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm here to share the results of the Transatlantic Trends Immigration Survey, which we run at the German Marshall Fund. This is a survey entirely about immigration and integration issues, and it captures transatlantic public opinion. So we have a number of European countries and the U.S. that are covered each year. This is part of GMF's longer-standing Transatlantic Trends Survey program, which has been going on for actually 10 years. So we do this with the support of several partners, the Compagnia di San Paolo, the Berg-Hedberg Trust, and the Fundación BBVA. To give you just briefly, today I'm just going to be discussing the most recent results from the fall of 2011. This year we were able to conduct the survey in the U.S., France, Germany, UK, Italy, and Spain. In each country we have telephone surveys of about 1,000 people. We do also call cell phones in Spain, Italy, and the U.S., where many people don't have access to a landline. And this took place between late August and early September of last year. To keep in mind as we're looking at the numbers, and this will be a PowerPoint really looking at the numbers, the maximum margin of error is plus or minus 3.1%. So take that into account when you're looking at these numbers. Spain was not included until 2009. And obviously, when I refer to the European average in these results, it's just the 5 European countries that we were able to survey this year. In previous years, we also have been able to survey additional countries, and we hope to be able to return to that larger sample. And we've been running this survey since 2008, so we actually have 3 previous years of questions as well that cover other topics. And if anyone is interested in learning more about the survey results, we make it widely available to researchers and policymakers. Okay. So these are the countries that we were able to survey. Nita asked me just to give a brief demographic background. So I just found some international migrant stock numbers. We see an increase in many countries, but actually stability in some countries. What we were able to survey, it's actually a 30-question questionnaire. So we're able to ask a lot of questions about a lot of different topics. I'll be going over sort of general perceptions toward immigrants and immigration. We were able to add a section this year in particular about the migration resulting from the Arab Spring and views of the EU's role in dealing with those flows. We also cover views on the impact of immigrants and immigration on the labor market and other economic concerns, integration and belonging questions, as well as questions on specific policy debates, specific policy trade-offs and alternatives. So we're really trying to address the hot policy discussions going on in these countries. The key findings, what we were expecting to find was in 2011 when we see the rise of populist parties, we saw quite extreme discourse surrounding the migration from the Arab Spring. We thought we would see a drop in optimism about immigration or more anti-immigrant sentiment, and that's not what we found. We actually found surprising stability in views toward immigrants and immigration. Secondly, we saw support for EU burden sharing on the flows from the Arab Spring, as well as growing support for an EU role in setting immigrant admissions numbers in general. We also asked about highly skilled versus low-skilled immigrants, also on top of many policy agendas. And we do see support for highly educated immigration, but still a preference for immigrants that have a job offer in hand. And overall optimism about immigrant integration, especially for the children of immigrants born in the country. So there's the top findings. So to start with some of the general perceptions, we asked people, what is the most or second most important issue facing your country today? And immigration is not at the top of people's minds. The economy and unemployment are very much at the top. Immigration comes far lower. So that's the percent of people who listed immigration as the most or second most important issue. We see the highest concern in the UK, where actually 30% list immigration as the most or second most important issue. On this stability, one of the sort of basic trend questions we've asked each year is, do you see immigration as more of a problem or an opportunity for your country? And we thought we would see an increase in this, the percent of people who see it as a problem. And again, we just saw not much change from previous years. Quite stable views in all the countries. Highest concern in the UK once again, and Spain, as well as the US. Another place where we saw stability, so you asked about numbers. Do you think there are too many, a lot, but not too many, or not many immigrants in your country? And this shows how many think there are too many. So we see high numbers in Spain, Italy, US, and the UK saying there are too many. That's not the majority view in Germany or France. And again, we just don't see much change from previous years. We saw a drop, you might note, in Spain and the US in 2010. But really, overall, it's a story of stability about these views. So people think in some of these countries we have a majority saying there are too many immigrants. But when you ask people to estimate what percent of your country is born in another country, what percent of residents were born in another country, we have that in blue. We have the actual percent foreign born in orange. So you see the public really does not have a good sense of how big the immigrant population is. They're off by a very large margin in all of the countries that we survey. We also asked about illegal immigration and legal immigration. So we ask, are you worried about illegal immigration? Are you worried about legal immigration? So this shows majorities of people are worried about illegal immigration, but majorities are not worried about legal immigration. We see far lower levels of concern about legal immigration. We also ask about, do you think that most immigrants are here illegally? And these are the percent of people who think most immigrants are here illegally. Again, a pretty big gap from actual demographics. Highest in the Spain, US, and Italy, where indeed undocumented immigration is a bigger problem, but still quite far off from reality. Okay, to move on to the Arab Spring and forced migration question, we actually, for the first time this year, asked about forced migration, and we're going to be talking about that later today. So we asked, do you think that people fleeing from the following circumstances should be allowed into your country? People seeking to avoid persecution, people seeking to avoid armed conflict, people seeking to avoid the aftermath of a natural disaster. And here we see very strong majorities in all the countries saying yes, people trying to avoid those circumstances should be allowed in. How about people seeking to avoid poverty? Actually, surprisingly quite high, but still lower, still far lower in Germany, the UK, and France, but really surprisingly high stated support for people seeking to avoid poverty. This is sort of a general case. When we take the specific case of migration resulting from the Arab Spring, so this we asked only to European countries, respondents in European countries. In light of the developments in North Africa and the Middle East, do you support your country taking the following steps to help countries in the region? Send development aid? Yes. Open up trade, lower trade barriers with those countries? Yes, very strong majorities. How about opening up your labor market? Much lower support. So kind of skepticism about opening up their labor markets to this migration from North Africa. However, we kind of pressed on that, and we asked, do you think your country should allow immigrants in from those North African countries permanently? No, we don't see majority anywhere saying they should be able to come permanently. But however, how about them coming temporarily? And we actually see majorities in every country saying migrants coming from that region should be allowed to come here temporarily. So again, a public that is a bit of a gap between the rhetoric among politicians and a public that seems perhaps more open to migration than we might expect. And the EU question, that was at the top of the headlines. Debate between France and Italy about what to do about the migrants. Lots of internal turmoil about what's the role of the EU, what's the role of individual countries in dealing with these flows. So we asked them, should the primary responsibility for incoming migrants from North Africa be shared by all countries in the EU, or should it be borne by the country of first arrival? And here we see very strong majorities actually in support of EU sharing the burden. It's interesting to compare this to the other EU question that we've asked in last year as well. And that's a more general question. We ask, do you think the national government should decide how many immigrants are allowed to come in each year? Or should the EU get to decide how many immigrants are allowed to come into your country? And in 2010, we did not see a majority anywhere preferring an EU responsibility. So not much support. Highest in France and Italy, but still not much support. We see increases in every single country in terms of support for actually an EU responsibility in setting immigrant numbers. So this is a really pretty interesting trend. We definitely want to keep our eye on this one in coming years. To move on to some economic issues, and I know I'm breezing through these, but I'm trying to get as much covered as possible. We ask about different consequences of immigration. So we asked, do you think immigrants fill jobs for which there are shortages? Do you think that immigrants take jobs away from natives? Do you think immigrants create new jobs by creating new businesses? Do you think they lower wages of natives? And do you think they place a burden on social services? So these are all separate questions, so they can agree and disagree with all of these things. And in the green, we actually see that the public understands that immigrants fill jobs for which there are shortages. Actually, majorities everywhere understanding that. On the other hand, it's a complex view. On some of the other issues, we see a bit of a divide between Europe and the US and UK, on the other hand. So in the US and UK, we do see more concern about a burden on social services and more concern about job displacement, about natives losing jobs to foreigners. But it's actually, the public sort of understands that For example, in the US, 68% say that immigrants fill jobs. 57% say immigrants take jobs. And, those are both true. So this is kind of an interesting view on it. One of the sort of key discussions going on in the economic role of migrants is the targeting of high-skilled migrants. So we asked, do you agree your country should let in more highly educated migrants? Yes. Very strong majorities say absolutely high-skilled migrants are the way to go. Do you think your country should allow in more migrants with a low level of education? No. We don't see a majority anywhere agreeing with that statement. However, when phrased as a trade-off, so we asked it another way, asked, in deciding which immigrants to admit, should the government give preference to immigrants with a high level of education but no job offer, or immigrants with a job offer but a lower level of education? So we actually see overall a preference for the lower educated immigrants with a job offer. So that's the red. So we see majorities in Spain, France, and Italy, very large, preferring that. And still the largest pluralities in Germany and the UK preferring that option. So you can see the public prefers high-skilled to low-skilled immigrants. On the other hand, they're still a little bit concerned about the possibilities of fitting into the labor market. On sort of some cultural and integration questions, we ask something that is very much at the top of discussions. Do you think immigrants are integrating well? This is the percent who agree immigrants are integrating well or very well. We also ask, we basically split the sample. So we ask half the public about immigrants. We ask half the public about Muslim immigrants. So we see relative optimism about immigrants integrating well. We see a fairly consistent Muslim penalty. So those asked about Muslim immigrants are less likely to say that their Muslim immigrants are integrating well or very well. However, when we then ask, how about the children of immigrants born in the country? How about the children of Muslim immigrants born in the country? We see far more optimism. So in other work that I'm working on with co-author Jolt Nairi at GMF, we're looking specifically at this topic and trying to delve into what we call the Muslim penalty and the generational bonus. So another cultural question we ask, many countries have debated citizenship policy. That's been at the core of these sort of intersections of culture and belonging and migration. We ask people, what do you think is the single most important criterion for obtaining citizenship? Is it long-term residence, sharing cultural values with the society, speaking the language, or respecting national institutions and laws? And in all the countries, we actually see far more focus on the latter two, language and respect for institutions and laws, than either values or long-term residence. This is another finding that is a little bit surprising given the rhetoric. So the highest support for language, or the sort of focus on language, is in Germany. And interestingly, the highest respect for institutions and laws is in Italy. And just to conclude with some government and policy questions, we really are sharing these results quite aggressively with policymakers, because we want it to sort of feed into the debates. So this is one that policymakers really like to hear. I mean, they don't like the results, but they're very interested in this question. And it asks, do you think the government is doing a good job managing immigration? This shows that majorities are saying their government is doing a poor or very poor job managing immigration. Majorities in all countries, and I mean up to 83% of Italians saying their government is doing a poor or very poor job. On a couple of the policy questions, of course, what to do about undocumented immigration is certainly at the top of many discussions, certainly in the U.S. So we ask, thinking about immigrants who are living in the country illegally, should they be required to return home, or should they be given the opportunity to obtain legal status that allows them to stay here? And overall, we see far more preference for required return in the UK. So 70% actually saying undocumented immigrants should be required to return home. Also highest in Italy and Spain. You'll note in the US that it's very split, half and half, which may explain why some of the sort of gridlock on this issue here in the US. It's really a split in the public. Another take on undocumented immigration issue, thinking about ways to reduce illegal immigration, what do you think is the most effective policy your government can do? Send development aid to those countries sending the flows, easing legal entry, punishing those employers who hire illegal immigrants in the country, or reinforcing border controls. And here we see a bit of a split. The UK and the US are definitely more enforcement-minded. They're more focused on employer sanctions and border controls. We see far more interest in the power of development aid, in the link to migration in Italy, France, and Spain. So these are pretty interesting results about how to reduce illegal immigration. They show a bit of a divide between these countries. I'm going to conclude there. I do have some other results. If you have any specific questions that you think we didn't tap into in the slides I showed, let me know what you're interested in, and I'll see if we have some other questions that I can show you the results. And you can find our key findings report and all sorts of information regarding this year's survey and previous year's surveys on our website. And I look forward to your questions later.
Great. Thank you very much, Amital. So we sort of got an overview of reality versus perceptions on immigration and immigration policy. And now we'll hear from Mary, who will present the MyPECs, which I guess is a tool for people to go from their perceptions to reality.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Well, I will confess that I am a student on these issues, certainly not an expert. The Immigration Policy Center focuses on U.S. Immigration issues, and we were actually approached by the Migration Policy Group in Brussels several years ago to become the American partner for the Migrant Integration Policy Index, which has been in existence since 2004. Until recently, it was a jointly funded project of the British Council and the European Union. The objective was to try to find a way to quantify many of the policy developments that were taking place in Europe in a way that could essentially provide a snapshot, I think, of what our perceptions of policy and what our perceptions of, immigrant integration issues were compared to what was actually happening on the ground. And as with most things, it's got its pluses and minuses and limitations. And what I wanted to do, especially because, my background is more in terms of, taking these tools and using them in the advocacy capacity, is to give you a little bit of an overview of MyPECs, but then to turn it to the ways that groups in Europe have been trying to use this tool to affect policy change, some of the constraints and obstacles they're facing, and then actually how Migration Policy Group has responded to that by initiating some new surveys that actually just came out. So initially, the index was designed to test the integration policies and practices in the 27 main EU countries. By the third edition, in the one in which we participated, it expanded, so it includes not only the main countries, but the Nordic countries, Canada, the United States, and in the course of the last year, they've also added Japan and Australia to this index of policy and integration developments. Essentially what happens is you get hit with one of those gigantic surveys of 148 different indicators of immigrant integration issues that are divided up across 7 categories: labor market mobility, family reunion, access to education, political participation, access to long-term residence, and access to nationality, then anti-discrimination claims. And so, at least for IPC, we were able to sort of internally handle all of the questions that related to immigration policies that are embedded in access to nationality, access to lawful permanent resident status, and family reunification. We actually partnered with some other groups that focus on education and equal rights and discrimination issues to answer the questions within the other categories. And they would drill down. So, for instance, on family reunification, there would be questions about how easy it was to bring over family members and reunite them with immediate relatives. Could you do it if you were a lawful permanent resident? How easy was it to bring over family members versus if you were a citizen of the country? Could same-sex couples marry and be recognized as be able to immigrate based on the basis of that relationship? So in each category, it would drill down on some of the possible options that were there, and of course, in the way surveys do, you could choose between 0, 1, 2, or 3 as your sort of mold for how much you were actually able to do that. The questions were based on overall European Union standards of integration and objectives. So the way MyPEX frames it is that it essentially identifies the highest European standards or the corresponding international standards aimed at achieving equal rights. And in the introduction to this volume, they note that in the European Union Work Program for 2010 to 2014, it reaffirmed the objective of granting comparable rights, responsibilities, and opportunities for all being at the core of European cooperation on integration. So MyPEX sort of started from the assumption that there was a need to be able to track in some way whether or not the European Union countries were coming together under the various agreements to actually have that sort of equal opportunity and cooperation throughout. And so from that perspective, its utility as a marker, as a benchmark, has a lot of institutional support. Simply because it does become a barometer that the EU and various other sort of more institutional bodies in Europe can use and point to say, this is how countries are ranking overall. And I apologize, I should have brought slides, and I didn't. But the numbers are not surprising. I have some of the books, and I have also some handouts. Unfortunately, we've actually run out of books. So I'm happy to say we distributed most of our allotment in the last year. But Sweden... and after all of these numbers are crunched, it's basically put on a 100-point scale. So Sweden topped the list at 83. Latvia was at the bottom with 31. And most countries were somewhere in between. The top 10 countries in terms of achieving the highest standards possible on these various integration categories were Sweden, Portugal, Canada, Finland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Spain. The U.S. was number 9. I think we got knocked down to 10 or 11 when Australia entered the queue, and Italy came in at 10. So what I found fascinating in this process really was that in working, MyPEX does a lot of sort of partnering, or MPG really does a lot of partnering with NGOs that are much in the frame of IPC. We have a strong research element, although most of our work is really synthesizing and bringing together research that's out there on immigration issues and converting it into sort of, immediate policy tools that people can use in the advocacy world or on Capitol Hill or with the media. But they were actually looking for organizations like ours that had both sort of the respect for research and the integrity of the process, but who could quickly convert that to advocacy or linked to the advocacy groups. And so most of the partners in Europe tend to be, of the same caliber. And so consequently, in the meetings to sort of plan the rollout and the communication strategies and such, what was really fascinating was the degree to which most of the advocacy groups were struggling with exactly the same questions we were struggling with in terms of thinking about the value of participating in this process, as well as how in the world we were going to sell the results to, our lawmakers, because it's not going to be surprising to anyone in this room that, comparative international analysis doesn't necessarily sell very well on Capitol Hill. And so to sit in a room with the representatives from the French and British and Canadian NGOs, because we were grouped in that category, and to hear everybody say, we're trying to figure out how to manage this issue that for a lot of our politicians, it's not going to be a bad thing that we're ending up, smack in the middle of the pack, or that the United Kingdom actually dropped quite a few points in the process because of more restrictive laws that had passed subsequent to in the time between the second and third MIPEX results. And so everyone was sort of really wrestling with this idea of there's a fundamental value to having this sort of comparative analysis as a snapshot to be able to say, overall, Spain is improving, or Portugal. The Portuguese delegates were great because they were like, or not they were great because they were like, we are so excited because we really are in that realm of creating immigration reform for the first time, creating laws and being a receiving country. And so consequently, when they came out, I think, as second or third in the MIPEX 2 index, it was cause for really quite a bit of rejoicing. They got tons of press. They were able to bring in a lot of politicians to talk about this. And so when they ranked number 2 in 2011, again, they were able to really pull a lot of high-ranking people into the discussion and do a lot of launch and rollout around it and use it as an advocacy tool, because it really represented for them not just a benchmark, but a real advance in the policies that were taking place. And so one of the things that the MPG found was that this tool was frequently most effective for the countries that were attempting to catch up and sort of make good with the overall EU standards, as well as countries that were, as well as NGOs who internally were trying to push for more equal rights, more civil rights protections, things like that. For countries that were already very much at that baseline and were going to score pretty well regardless, the impact of the study itself was not necessarily going to be as great. So for instance, one of the limitations of the study is that because you're asking all these questions, but you end up turning it into a 100-point survey, the UK can reduce its nationality or limit its nationality access. It can increase the possibility that spouses have to be able to speak English before they enter. But because that's probably only going to be one question on the 148 question survey, it may only make a difference, plus or minus 1 in where it ranks. So there is an inherent limitation in how much you can really do with a survey of this kind. But all of that being said, MPG has really, I think, done an excellent job trying to build in ways to work through and around that. So, for instance, on their website, the survey itself is interactive, so you can go in and you can change the factors. So let's see what would happen, for instance, if suddenly, I'll just use the U.S. as an example because that's, of course, what I'm most familiar with. If we were to change the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship was no longer a right, what would that do to our score? And so you can go in and you can play around with that, and you can create various charts to sort of visually show to people that, it can make a difference. Nonetheless, when we did that, we found that we essentially ended up maybe dropping 1 or 2 points overall. So we'd still end up like 9th or 10th in the country, or in the world, which is, not at all indicative of what a serious problem that would be. But what we did find, and what my my colleagues in Europe found as well, was that it did give you an avenue and a tool to talk to people about issues that, for the most part, are very difficult to quantify. And so you frequently find yourself in debates, again using the U.S. as an example, where people like Congressman Lamar Smith will say, well, birthright citizenship is ridiculous. Nobody in Europe does this. We should be, following that model. And you can use MyPEX to say that, in fact, the trend is to try to move more towards creating more rights at birth and easier access to citizenship. You can use it to say, for instance, that we are appalling in the United States in terms of the fees that we charge for the lawful permanent residence and citizenship applications and things like that, because the survey actually tracks those kinds of things. And so you have sort of the baseline information, but then you have the more detailed information that scholars and academics can get into to sort of play around with this. And so in the evaluation that they conducted at the end of the MyPEX 3 period, one of the critical things that people found was that there's a high degree of commitment to continuing to participate in this survey, even though the availability of funding to do it is rapidly declining. The evaluator put it nicely and said that there's a huge dichotomy between commitment and funding, but one of the participants from Central Europe put it much, much more on point. Spending money on migration is seen as a poor choice, and private companies don't want to damage their image by getting being perceived as giving in this area. There are very few options for funding this kind of work. And yet, when surveyed, virtually every group that was surveyed said that they intended to continue to be part of this process. They intended to try to find the funds from elsewhere. The British Council has decided they're not going to participate anymore in terms of funding, at least, because they're narrowing down their interests, and they're cut with they've hit a lot of funding problems as well. But that the commitment is huge. And that many policymakers who were surveyed actually said that it has become an excellent resource in Europe for doing this kind of, at least raising the interest level on these issues. And so, as I said, I apologize for not having the slides, but I encourage you to take a look at the books, which when they came out, my daughter, who was about 10 at the time, she had so much fun with it. I mean, usually now we just don't hold books in our hands like this and play around with it, but there's really in-depth analysis of each country that participated, and consequently, she could go, okay, I want to see what Germany did on this, and I want to see what, Finland did on this. And, for a 10-year-old to find it engaging, I think many of you might as well. Well, actually, that doesn't sound good, does it? But you know what I mean. That it has some value at every level of engagement, I think, in thinking differently about these processes. And I think it complements very well the Transatlantic survey, in that it gives some detail to it. One of the criticisms, and then I'll stop, is that because it surveyed policy laws on the books, it was a snapshot of what maybe was aspirational, but wasn't necessarily what was happening on the ground. And one of the ways to try to counter this was a new program that MPG just began and really just rolled out this month. The rollout's going on all summer, which is an immigrant citizen survey that was conducted in 7 countries, 15 cities across Europe, to try to assess what the migrants' voice in all of this was. And what's fascinating about it, and I literally just learned about this last night, but what's fascinating about it is that I think it parallels in many ways the study, the Transatlantic Trend study, because most immigrants have very high and very positive feelings, according to this survey, about their position in their country, about their ability to fully access benefits, about their desire to become a citizen and to fully participate. And the obstacles that MyPEX identified in terms of access to fully becoming a citizen or fully becoming a lawful permanent resident, and education were the same frustrations that many of the migrants felt, but that their overall attitude about their experience was much more positive than we sometimes might think from the what's at the top of the paper. So I encourage you to use this as an additional tool, and I look forward to learning more about the topic over the course of the day.
Thank you very much, Mary. Finally, for this panel, we have Jamie Bartlett, who will talk about why are we hearing so much more rhetoric on the right?
Jamie Bartlett will also try to
find your PowerPoint.
We should have.
Maybe look at my desk. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay, very good.
So embarrassing to show everybody how illiterate I am on these computers when I should be.
When
I'm going to be talking
right?
about social media. Well, thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate being invited here. And what I'm going to talk about is the populist parties that we've seen growing over the last 10, 15 years or so all across Western and Eastern Europe. Who those people are, what they think, and a few comments really on where I think it's going to go. More specifically, though, I'm going to talk about a brand new data set that we collected at my think tank Demos. It's an independent think tank. I won't go into the details. You can find all of that online. Over the summer of last year, we collected 13,000, incredible data set, 13,000 survey responses from the Facebook fans of these populist parties. Now, I'll talk a bit about the methodology, how we went to go about doing that, why we think this group is increasingly important and isn't just a trifling bunch of collectivists, and how they relate to the voters and the activists that you actually see on the street for these parties. Because essentially there are two trends going on in politics in Europe at the moment. One is certainly the increase of all types of radical, extreme political parties, but particularly on the right. But the other is the way that social media is changing political involvement and engagement, particularly among young people. And this presentation, hopefully, is where the two of them meet. This is the first time I've presented this data, actually, in the US, so this is my on the Ed Sullivan show moment, I suppose. Just ignore the hair and everything. Just to quickly show you something before I go into any of the real details. This is our dear friend Marine Le Pen's wonderful Facebook page. Of course, the leader of the Front National. She looks rather delightful. She has 80,000 people that like her. But what's striking about this, I think, is the way that what she does very well is shares stories in a two-way conversation with her supporters. She can speak directly to 80,000 people whenever she wants, and they speak directly back to her. She gets ideas and information from them, and she passes them out. This is really, really important. Now, I won't use all of these slides because I've got too many. One of the reasons Facebook is valuable as a data source for us, and why it's important to understand who these people are, is all across Western Europe, formal membership in political parties is falling, especially in the mainstream parties. It's been going on for at least 10 years, probably longer. These smaller right-wing populist parties, and I'll go through the ones we surveyed in a moment, their membership similarly has been growing slightly, but not that much, but their Facebook membership pages have grown incredibly quickly, and they by far outnumber the formal membership that they have. So if you just look down here, this is some of the people that we surveyed. By the way, the Party voor de Vrijheid is Geert Wilders' Freedom Party, and he's so arrogant that he's the only one that allows himself to be a member, incredibly. But if you look, the Facebook membership, more broadly speaking, is about three times more than the formal membership of those parties. Now, for the mainstream parties, the ratio is reversed, actually, interestingly. It takes about 3 members to get one single Facebook fan of your group. Right, so I'm just going to tell you how we did it. So in the summer of last year, between June and August, and actually the Anders Breivik terrorist attack took place in the middle of us collecting our data, and we can maybe talk about how that would have affected our data set. What we realised was that there were these huge Facebook fans of all of these parties, and actually, if you go on Facebook, you're probably constantly bombarded on the right-hand side with adverts that are targeted to you on the basis of your demographic, on the basis of your express preferences, on the basis of the fact that I'm obviously on a diet here apparently, but that's, don't know why that's there, that's not my Facebook page. Now, this is the way that Facebook makes its money. I'm sure all the discussion about its initial public offering has really brought that to light, actually, the way that it sells data to private companies that they use to target advertising on those different categories. Well, we realised that actually you could do exactly the same on Facebook on the basis of whether you like a particular political party or not. So that's simply... Oh, I've got to talk into the mic. Oh, God, yeah. Could you hear me before? Did no one hear a word I said? So we realised that you could target people in the same way on the basis of their political preferences. And so that's what we did. And you can see for the English Defence League, we gave a little St George's flag and invited them to click on a survey. When they clicked on it, they went to a standardised consent form online, and then they completed the survey, about 15 questions on a variety of political and social and demographic measures. And so you can just see the sample size here. This is the Western European data set. We targeted nearly 500,000 people. We ended up with over 10,000 completed responses. Now, there's obviously a lot of methodological issues here with self-selection bias, and not to mention who these Facebook people actually are. We asked questions to find that out, and I'll tell you who they are in a moment. But we can't say that these are formal members of this party, and we don't even know whether they always vote. In fact, they often do, but not always. What they are is a new group of people that are increasingly significant in understanding these political movements, actually. Any statistical and methodological questions maybe we could save, and I will go through, I can talk about that. I mean, we recognise the weakness of the data set. We reweighted it in terms of basic demographics, but we couldn't reweight it for attitudes, so we don't really know yet whether the most angry people are the most likely to click or whatever, but that's something that is inherent in all internet surveys, but we need to be aware of that. We haven't included here, by the way, the survey of the Jobbik party in Hungary. They came back with quite different responses, so we didn't include, not going to include it here, but we might want to talk about that later. So, in order of the people that we surveyed, so you know the groups we're talking about. In the United Kingdom, it was the British National Party and the English Defence League. In France, we had the Front National and Bloc Identitaire. We had the Danish People's Party, the Norwegian Progress Party, the Swedish Democrats, the True Finns, Lega Nord in Italy, Casa Pound in Italy, the Freedom Party in Germany, the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, Vlaams Belang in Belgium, and I believe that's it. John, my colleague, might step in and say I've missed them. I normally always miss. So it's a large data set, and what I'm going to present to you now are the aggregate scores from all of those groups. So this gives you a good insight into who these people are. As it happens, the results here, this is the largest data set by far ever collected on this group, but actually on these people as a whole, is broadly similar to what we know anyway from voter surveys of these people. So there's not too much of a difference. Now, I'm going to give you 6 characteristics, and that's it. And the first is that they tend to be young men, 75% are male. That, again, is fairly similar. They tend to be under 30, about 2/3 of them under 30. That isn't just because Facebook is comprised primarily of young people, or even that these groups are just made up of young people. Facebook's demographics has changed a lot over the last 3 or 4 years. It's now more sort of broadly representative of the populations as a whole. They're not particularly likely to be unemployed. 14% in our sample were unemployed, compared to the average of the countries in question. When we did the survey, that's changed now, of around 7%. But if you age weight it as well, because our sample is young and unemployment among under 25s in Europe is very high, it's not that different. So they're not that much more likely to be unemployed. The outliers are the different countries, because there's a big difference between certain countries, and unfortunately I probably don't have time to go into that with the little amount of time I have. These aren't people who have given up entirely on politics. They think it really matters who you vote for. 16% only think that it doesn't matter. And actually, there's no single measure that we can compare that to pan-European, but if you look at various bits and pieces of data across Europe, it's really about the same as a national average. A lot of people think voting doesn't matter and all the parties are the same. These guys aren't particularly more likely to think that. They don't, however, think that politics is a particularly effective way to have their concerns addressed, only 35%, and that is lower than the countries in question. Do they agree that violence is justified if the right outcome can be secured? Not particularly. That's got to be taken with a pinch of salt, really, because I think we can all justify certain types of violence in certain circumstances. But when you compare it across countries, unsurprisingly, the Scandinavians are the least likely to answer yes to that question, and Casa Pound in Italy, and some of the street-based movements that we are, so the English Defence League, Casa Pound, and Bloc Identitaire are more likely to say yes, it is. We asked about, these are very standard questions, and here we can compare them to existing data from the Eurobarometer data set of the averages of the countries we've surveyed. They're actually, surprisingly, more optimistic personally about their own lives, about the next 12 months of their own lives, than the average person in that country, than their co-citizen. 27% against 27%. It's about the same, but they're not particularly pessimistic about their own future. And this leads to a point I'll make in a moment in a bit more detail, that these aren't really the losers of globalization. These are people that personally are doing reasonably okay. What they do have a concern with is about the future of their country. Only 10% of them think that their country's on the right track. And 3%, the outlier there, was Vlaams Belang, which was probably not surprising given that in the middle of 2011 it looked like the country literally was going to break up. So they have relative personal optimism, or an average, but they are extremely pessimistic about their own futures, their own country's future. What are the things that really bug them then? We ran a number of questions on this, and I'll just give you a couple of examples here. It's interesting with the immigration as a top two concern, because we took this from the Eurobarometer survey. Sweden, forget that for a moment. Your data is actually slightly different on this, which I thought was quite interesting. So I've got to figure out what that means. But overwhelmingly, the concerns that they have were not economic, they were cultural. They were concerns about immigration. 37% thought that it was one of the two most important problems facing the country. And for them, the European Union did not mean, free markets, free travel across the continent. It meant a loss of cultural identity, and second top answer there was a lack of control over external borders. When we asked them why they joined the party in question, in an open response question that we asked, it was that national culture, if I could try to summarize, our national culture and our national identity is under threat. It's under threat from economic globalization, it's under threat from high levels of immigration, from low levels of integration, and it's under threat from the politicians that seem to be unwilling or unable to do anything about it. This was the thing really that drives them to vote for these parties, if you have to try to sort of crystallize it. And the fifth characteristic is some generalized stats on trust. Their levels of generalized trust, which is the first column there, the extent to which you agree, to what extent you agree that other people in general can be trusted, is a useful proxy for social capital. Now here we see that they are slightly less likely to trust other people than the average, but not a huge amount. And actually in some countries it was rather more. In Britain, for the British National Party and the Front National, it was higher than the average. And that's probably because there's quite tight, partly by a virtue of being on some of these networks, it's quite a networked organisation where they trust each other, they spend a lot of time together, they're all fine, but it's the government and the people out of touch that I don't trust. And that's reflected in the stats that we have on the institutional trust. So, on the whole, what we have across all of these, we asked maybe 10 questions, we gave them 10 options on this. They tend to mirror the national average, according to the EU Barometer, by about 20% lower. So if in Scandinavia, 70% of people trust the government, in Scandinavia it's about 50% in our group. They're always about between 15 and 20% lower than the average for pretty much every institution. But there are a couple that are spectacularly low that I think is really important. The first is the judiciary. Only 30% of them believe that the judiciary can be trusted. To me, that speaks of a generalized sense of injustice in society, particularly in relation to the double standards and the special treatment that immigrants receive from the judiciary. 20% compared to 43% trust the government, and a very low level trust the European Union. It's quite interesting, actually, that the narrative of these parties is slowly shifting towards the EU, towards the EU's inability to fix the problem of the financial crisis, and towards the inability of the EU's leaders to in any way represent the people of the countries in question. There's another statistic here that I didn't include, which is trust in mainstream media. That's also incredibly low. Around 10% of the people in our survey trusted the mainstream media, compared to a sort of generalized skepticism across Europe of about 30-40% trust the mainstream media. And I think that's important for a reason I'll say at the end. And then finally, I suppose one of the most important questions, and I think it's an important question for everyone, is what's the relationship between online activism and offline activism? No one can really figure this out yet. We now see that small groups of people are able to create huge amounts of problems for police and law enforcement and others. We don't really know the extent to which people that do stuff online also do stuff offline, and whether you can use that as a useful proxy or a guide. We have a really good example in the UK of the English Defence League that uses Facebook to organise itself, and I've spent a lot of time with this group. They had about 100,000 Facebook fans, and they would use that to bully local authorities and the police into how many numbers were going to turn up to a demonstration to make sure the local authority would, not grant planning permission to this new mosque. And the local authorities and the police had really no idea whether this was true or not. But all they saw was a very vibrant, buzzy, active Facebook page and got rather worried about it. So part of the study here was to understand that relationship. Now, if you look, about a third of the people that are Facebook fans of these groups are also formal members. That's actually rather high, given that not many people are formal members at all. Secondly, nearly 70% of them, two-thirds of them, actually voted for the party. I put 2007 because that was for Sweden, but we asked to the last general election, did you vote for the party in question? And 67% of them did. Now, given that many of them weren't even able to vote for the party at the last general election, because so many of them are under 21 or 18, that's really high, and I think it's probably going to be higher and higher for the next elections. And then finally, how many of them have taken part in a demo? And in brackets, it's the national average, the average across Europe of how many people have taken part in a demonstration in the last 6 months. I think it's 12 months. It's only 6%. Whereas for our group, it's 1 in 4 have actually been out demonstrating. So this is why this is an important sample, an important group. They're active and they're motivated and they're going out there and doing something about it. Social media for them is a bridge into real-world politics, not some kind of vacuum that takes all of their energy away from that. So just a couple of final points. The meta-finding, if you like, here, was that those people across our data set, and this is relevant in light of Anders Breivik in particular, and trying to understand the relationship between these groups and more extreme and violent individuals. The people that were also involved in the offline activity, those that were formal members or those that had taken part in a demonstration, were actually far more moderate on a number of levels, had higher levels of trust in institutions than the people that were only involved on Facebook, that were only the social media fans, that limited themselves to following these parties online and never actually did anything in the real world. And so to me, one of the important, it's a hypothesis, of course, but actually going out there and doing something and being involved politically and civically, even if it's with groups that we might disagree with or we have a problem with some of the things they say, is actually a positive thing on balance. And it's the people that get lost in these online bubbles and fantasies are the ones that we really need to be worried about. The second thing is that these are a young group of people. They are active, as I've said. I think they're going to start having an increasingly disproportionate amount of influence over the party as social media continues to become the way in which people organise. They have real concerns, and for many of them, these parties are no longer sort of neo-Nazi fascist groups. They're the parties that can appeal to them because they're able to talk about they're talking about economics, they're talking about protecting their jobs and workers' rights, and often a sort of left-wing social policy, which is quite, which is actually quite generous, and also their genuine concerns about their identity and their national culture being under threat. And they're using a medium which relates directly to their everyday lives. It's no longer about meeting once every 4 years. Voting every 4 years and meeting once every 6 months in a dingy room somewhere. It's stuff that they can do daily, hourly, in the middle of their workplace, be constantly sharing stories with each other. The second part about this is the changing way in which media consumption is affecting these people. Increasingly, and you look at the stats on their levels of trust in mainstream media, as I mentioned, but the high levels of trust in each other, and what you find is that they are constantly surrounded and sharing stories which appear to corroborate their position. I mean, this goes back to what you were saying about the big discrepancy between the number of migrants in a country and how many people think that there are. And you see that with these groups as well. They don't find themselves to be Islamophobic because they're constantly reading stories about Muslims trying to take over Europe. And that partly begins to get to why it's very difficult to break into these groups, because Marine Le Pen has direct channels of unmediated communication with nearly 100,000 people. And no one's ever questioning what she's saying there, because the administrators of that group can just stop them. So I think you take these trends at your peril. These groups, I don't see them growing a huge amount in the next year or two, but they're important, they're sizable, and their members are not always exactly what you think.
Thank you very much. I was hoping to sort of give us a landscape, clear landscape, but I think a lot more questions come up when we have all of this sort of almost conflicting realities when you look at different levels of society, when you use different methodologies to sort of measure what's happening. So let me quickly open the floor for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to be brought to you. Terry, we'll start. Please also introduce yourself before you ask. Any other hands for questions?
Hi, I'm Terry Gibbons, and I'm a professor at the University of Texas and also a Woodrow Wilson Center Policy Scholar starting this week. So, and I want to make a comment and have a question. The comment is just that as I've done research on all of these topics, actually, it is very difficult to get good data, and so I'm really interested in what Jamie's doing, because it's not just a question of the data, but also figuring out where are these people, where are they showing up, basically, and they're showing up clearly on Facebook, whereas if you just look at a regular election survey, you wouldn't get that same kind of information. So I want to talk more with you about that, because it links in very nicely with some of the work I did back in the late 90s and early 2000s on trying to get a handle on who are these people who are supporting the far right. But I guess my question is more for Jamie. How do you see this as an ongoing project and looking at how maybe these groups are evolving over time? And I know that the MIPEX and the Transatlantic Trends has done a good job of kind of looking at these trends over time, and I think it'd be interesting to do something similar for support for the far-right parties as well.
Any other questions we can take? Yes.
Thank you very much. This was excellent. I'm Susan Pierce, and I teach at East Carolina University, and I'm a fellow here as well. Hi, Mary. And my question is about this EU policy on immigration versus national policies within Europe, and maybe all of you know a little about this. The last I looked into it, I was told that there's kind of a lowest common denominator or high or whatever it is, that the EU takes the most restrictive national policies and then applies that as the EU policy. And I'm just wondering, I'm thinking about that question, Hamatul, that you ask about whether you would prefer the EU versus your own national immigration policy, and whether people know that. Well, first of all, is that true still? And secondly, do people know that and assume that the EU policy is the more restrictive one, and therefore that's the one that I prefer?
Any other questions from the floor? Great, so maybe we can have some responses. And I think maybe you might have some questions for each other, so feel free to chime in. Jamie,
I'll just can take the. I mean, the interesting thing for me on the research question is improving methods like this. I think we've done quite an involved survey. Really, it was sort of typical survey stuff, but it was just using a new way of recruiting people with all of its concomitant weaknesses. But actually, there's a lot of automated social media data collection tools that are out there now that give you access to vast amounts of data that you could never imagine, but it's dominated by computer scientists. And I think social scientists, especially in terms of sampling and methodology, should be getting much more involved in improving ways that we can do that. In particular, in respect of ethics, because I think there's a lot of ethical questions about some of the automated data collection things we do. So that's where really I want to develop it, perhaps more so than the specifics of these groups. Although I would like to run some surveys on the growing other groups that are becoming increasingly active online and then translating that into offline activities such as the Occupy movement and the Pirate Party in Germany and so on. So I think there are two ways that I would really like to take it. Another question, though, for me, thinking about the research that I've found so far and where I'd like to take it is why is it that a party like the British National Party does so badly? When the UK scores so, you'd expect it to have far more support when you looked at that data that you both presented than it does. And why is it that certain countries buck the trend? And France, Marine Le Pen can get 18%. And in Sweden and Norway, maybe the Norwegian Progress Party is a little bit different, but particularly in Denmark, incredible support for the Danish Progress Party, for the Danish People's Party. So it's interesting to compare, I think, our data sets on the support for these parties with the immigration policy and general attitudes in the country and see what it is that means some countries, there's a real market for these parties. In other places where you'd expect there to be, there's not one. Well, I'd love to hear it.
Do you want to talk about changes over time in the countries?
Well, I have written down some of the trends that the MDG folks had noted, but I'm so sorry. But I think maybe the most salient point is that one of the things they found was that it was often incredibly difficult to get to a particular point. So to have real access to lawful permanent resident status or nationality. But that once you did, in the European countries at least, it was very difficult to lose it or for the policy to revert, which, I think kind of may match up with some of what Jamie was observing, that, that it's much more solid. And actually one of the things we learned was how fragile lawful permanent resident status in the United States is compared to most European countries. And so there are moments like that where I think in some ways you can sort of see that the institutional nature of some of these integration policies is useful because it can withstand the change of time and the sort of political winds a little better once you've gotten to that institutional point. It's when you don't have that institutional protections that it seems like there's even greater weaknesses that are possible. So at some level, the UK can thumb its nose a little bit, or France can thumb its nose a little bit, because there's a certain baseline level of protections that are there. So it's harder to critique them. But I don't know how that applies, Susan, in the context of the Southern European countries and the other countries who are literally trying to build from the ground up. I mean, things like this, I think, are very aspirational, and they seem pretty high standards to me. So I don't know how it fits.
Yeah. So on the EU question, so I mean, what's surprising is that the public seems to increasingly want to sort of give up a bit of national sovereignty and letting the EU weigh in on these decisions, which we have decided, which are generally understood as so key to national level authorities. And you really put your finger on something that came up a lot when we presented this data to EU policymakers in Brussels, and they always said, "Oh, that's really interesting, but does that mean people want more inclusionary or more exclusionary policies?" And the truth is, our survey questions didn't really capture that, so we don't really know the answer. And we're going to try to modify it in next year to try to kind of piece it out a little bit. And if anyone has suggestions on ways we can do this, we're eager to hear it. But you're right. It's not clear if saying I would prefer an EU role means it's not clear what that means. In terms of actual policy practices and how much the EU is already telling countries what to do with their immigration policies, I mean, I'm sure there are many experts in the room on this, but from what I can understand, the level of harmonization and actual EU role in setting legal admissions policies is pretty minimal at this point, and basically countries are still making those decisions on their own. The only area that has really had any successful harmonization is maybe enforcement against illegal immigration and increasing sort of cooperation on border control, and maybe on asylum seeking and how that intersects with enforcement. But in terms of setting immigration numbers, which is how we phrase the question, there's not, I mean, the EU isn't really having a very strong role yet in telling countries how many people they can let in. On Jamie's point about membership in these parties, I'm so glad. It was so interesting to hear about this project. We often get questions about, party identification, and unfortunately in our survey, the party identification numbers are too low for us to really say anything about, people who actually said they're members of these various parties and what their views are on these various questions. So I think this is a great way to get at those people. I would imagine, and so on a survey like this, after you've been asked all of these questions about immigration, what's the value of immigrants, I guess there's probably a taboo against then saying, yes, I'm a member of Lega Nord, right? So I assume that's part of the reason it's so hard to identify these people. And yeah, so I'm really looking to hearing more and seeing if we can try to triangulate somehow between our work.
Well, that seems to be the sort of the focus of this whole day, of the question is whether or not ideas that were once taboo in Europe are actually now moving towards the mainstream. I mean, this is something that we're experiencing in the United States as well, which is why we sort of invited the comparison with the U.S. and Europe. And the larger question is, are democratic institutions in all of these countries, including the United States, good enough to be able to sort of keep this conversation still nonviolent and open and moving towards an end that will maintain, or at least maintain, and not drop this level of protection of migrants and integration of different peoples.
May I give you one tiny little example, because I knew I had a good one in here. One of the things that the MIPEX folks found between 2007 and 2010, so between MIPEX 2 and MIPEX 3, was that essentially access to becoming a lawful permanent resident it really hadn't changed much. But what had changed on the margins, and this I think is really interesting, was the requirements to get to that status. So for instance, in 1999, Germany was the only EU member state to impose a language requirement, and that between 2007 and 2010, what they were beginning to find was that more countries were imposing, initial upfront language requirements or doing other things on the margins. And we're seeing that here as well, that the standards that routinely have been used to allow someone to naturalize are more and more becoming imposed on people at the lawful resident stage. And so, one conjecture about that, I think, is that people respect sort of the institutional notion of having this process, but the debate then becomes, what does it take to get to that initial point? And it plays right into the cultural issues and the concern about identity, so that we're now expecting people to, bring, in Europe, in England or the United States, bring the English language with them, rather than, learning it as part of becoming a citizen. And I think so. It's the requirements and the additional hoops and obstacles that people have to go through that may be where you really see a lot of this play out.
We are actually butting up against our coffee break, but this was meant to be sort of an introduction to a wider discussion that will continue out throughout the day. So please join me in thanking our panelists for their great presentation.